California State Digital Equity Plan, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Notice of Funding Opportunity Briefing. On behalf of the State of California and the Department of Technology, we thank you for being here. We will begin the meeting shortly. Please, as participants join, use the chat box to share your name, job title, and affiliated organization. Okay, if the Zoom admin can please start recording. Thank you. Good afternoon, and again, welcome to the California State Digital Equity Plan and National Telecommunications and Information Administration State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Notice of Funding Opportunity Briefing. On behalf of the State of California and the Department of Technology, we thank you for being here. Please use the chat box to share your name, job title, and affiliated organization. And can you please review the housekeeping items?
Of course, thank you. My name is Ann Nguyen, and I will be reviewing the housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. We will be posting the recording of this meeting slides and transcripts to the Broadband for All portal. Presenters, please cue Amanda to advance your slides. Please follow along on the screen. Please select side-by-side speaker mode for the best viewing experience when slides are shared, like it is now, and to visibly see our ASL interpreters. Closed captions are available at the bottom of your toolbar. Please select Show Subtitle. Q&A, there will be time for questions and answer after each agenda item. Please add your questions in the Q&A box so that our team will be able to elevate it. Please make sure to use the Q&A throughout the presentations, as your questions may be lost in the chat. Additionally, at the end of each presentation, when prompted, please feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the toolbar. You can also dial *9 if you're calling in by phone. Next, I would like to introduce our Deputy Director, Scott Adams of the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy, to provide a brief welcome and overview of the agenda. Scott?
Thank you, Ann, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Adams. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy at the California Department of Technology. The purpose of this briefing today is to provide you, critical stakeholders and partners throughout the state who contributed to the development of the State Digital Equity Plan over the last year through many different planning activities, whether attending planning group meetings, working group meetings, regional workshops, promoting and responding to surveys or other planning efforts. We wanted to brief you on where we're at right now and engage you in a further conversation on our joint efforts to foster digital equity throughout the state through the implementation of the Digital Equity Plan and our steps we're taking to secure funding from the NTIA to support the implementation of the plan. We thank those of you who provided questions during the registration process. We've done our best to shape the information that we will share today to answer those questions. There may be some we can't answer now that will require further thought, but we'll get back to you on those. I do want to note we have a full agenda this afternoon. As Ann mentioned, there's an opportunity for question and answer in between each of the agenda items for question and engagement. In a moment, I'm going to provide an update on the status of the final digital equity plan and its various components and what we're working towards. We'll then hear from Sean Doherty, the Director of Broadband Equity Partnership, who's working with CDT as a program manager on our digital equity efforts. She's going to provide an update on the NTIA State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Notice of Funding Opportunity, and kind of underscore the work that the department's doing right now as we're applying for that grant, which will provide funding for the plan. Lastly, Ann Wind, who you heard from earlier, is going to talk about or share information about future opportunities for engagement and collaboration, and also helping to further shape the overall state capacity grant program and the sub grant program design. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, Amanda. Thank you. So I think what we wanted to do to shape this briefing with you all is to recap that we're very thankful for all of the folks who provided public comment. In total, there were 141 public comments. What you see here are some of the general themes that led to that people commented on, and many of these led to further modifications of the draft digital equity plan to get to the final plan we turned into NTIA. Much of it was about covered populations, measurable objectives, barriers for covered populations, approach to adoption in ACP, state managed versus local efforts, digital literacy training, digital navigation and grant framework, and implementation and timeline details, as well as ongoing collaboration. Next slide, please. What we wanted to share with you is that as a result of the modifications from the public comment process, we did submit a final plan to the NTIA, which was approved on March 28th. So congratulations to everyone, and thank you for your efforts to shape that plan and seek its approval. The good news is that the plan being approved now qualified the state to apply for its statutory allocation of the federal digital equity capacity grants. That notice of funding opportunity was released the day after our plan was approved on March 29th. And California's allocation was announced at $70.2 million. The next key date we wanted to share with you is that we are right now preparing a preliminary application to submit to the NTIA by next Tuesday, May 28th. And for those of you, I know some folks asked the question, the digital equity plan, the final digital equity plan can be found by using the QR code and going to the Broadband for All portal. Within the final plan is a section that actually outlines the general themes and the public comments, and we provide reference to where the plan was modified in that section. Next slide, please. So the one thing we wanted to just stress moving forward is that as we form the plan and as we now implement the plan and look forward to utilizing federal capacity grant dollars, that the state is going to follow the federal guidelines and really focus our efforts on the covered populations that you see on this screen. For most of you, these are not new. It's individuals in covered households, aging individuals, incarcerated individuals, veterans, individuals with disabilities, folks with language barriers, members of racial and ethnic minority groups, and individuals who reside primarily in rural areas. We also, because of the close coordination with the Public Utilities Commission and the BEAD program, we'll be focusing on women and those who identify as female and members of the LGBTQI plus community. Next slide. Thank you. So we wanted to highlight again that with the planning and kind of a result of the workshops, that the digital equity plan outlines 7 key activities that we are going to be following and funding to support implementation of the plan and its goals. And those are complete broadband for all infrastructure investments on state and federal timelines, to convene digital equity stakeholders, refine digital equity data and maps, develop digital equity capacity subgrant program, fund state-managed digital inclusion programs, and develop digital inclusion tools and best practices. And more importantly, it's to continue to promote low-cost service offers and subsidy programs that can support affordability and adoption. Next slide, please. So the way that the plan is shaped is there's the key activities consistent with Broadband for All's 3 main goals. There are specific measurable objectives for each of the goals. So for instance, goal 1 is all Californians have high performance broadband available at home, schools, libraries, and businesses. These are the 4 measurable objectives that we will work towards and track as we implement, towards this goal. Amanda, can you please move to the next page? So on goal 2, which is that all Californians have access to affordable broadband and necessary devices, there's another set of 4 measurable objectives that we will work to. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read them all, but we will post this presentation along with the recording of this briefing on the Broadband for All portal after sometime next week. Next slide, please. And so lastly, again, the way the plan was designed, the 3rd goal is all Californians can access training and support to enable digital inclusion. There are 6 measurable objectives that we will be tracking and measuring against in our work, particularly that which is funded by the federal capacity grants. Next slide, please. And then really just to underscore that the digital equity plan is tracking all of the Broadband for All work. The parts of the plan that can be funded with capacity grants are really the non-infrastructure pieces. So developing and refining local digital equity plans, conducting broadband adoption campaigns, providing digital navigation or digital literacy and skills training, having funding targeted device distribution, and then targeted workforce development training and apprenticeships. And so I believe that is the last piece that I have on the digital equity plan. Anne or Cole, can we now open it up to questions or comments from folks?
Yeah, the one question, Scott, that we've gotten so far in Q&A that would be of interest just to share with the larger group is just where to find the state digital equity plan.
Yes, absolutely, Cole. So it's on the QR code that we had in the previous slide, but our team here will drop the link in the chat, and the plan can be found. There's a separate digital equity plan set of pages on the California Broadband for All portal.
Great, thank you, Scott. And we do have 2 questions. I'm going to ask Hector. You now can unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I'm using I'm looking at the sign language interpreter. I have one on my end, and I'm using CART as well. I'm a person with a disability. Thank you. My name is Hector Ramirez. I'm in Los Angeles County. And I really want to thank you for this particular space. This particular issue right now is of significant importance to people with disabilities in the state of California, and a lot of California residents. For many of us, the access to internet is both a necessity and a general purpose service at this point. However, because of the changes and lots of funding supporting both the availability of access materials and training, really is risking a lot of our community not having access to those particular vital cares that allow us to stay healthy, to work, to be part of our community, and to really just thrive. Now with the changes in AI being introduced and the significant costs additionally to it, I fear that this is another opportunity in which we have both the opportunity to be left behind or to really be engaged as community stakeholders. One of the reasons that I think a lot of the folks that have been able to sign up for health coverage here in California was because they're able to really access a lot of their services remotely, as well as information and availability to network. The limitation in this particular arena has the potential to significantly impact the well-being not only of all Californians with disabilities, but our younger ones who are struggling to go to school and catch up and are dealing with for family members that are working remotely with isolation and looking for support, and definitely for our older community who are still dealing, or like many of us, we have generational knowledge and sometimes we get left behind, and so really taking in consideration the significant chilling impact that the economic and policy change is having, and the importance to really have people with disabilities and older adults or seniors as a driving stakeholder community in these particular decisions, both in the funding for internet, but also in the conversations around the AI that the state is taking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments, Hector, and we agree. And we're proud of the process that led to the development of the final digital equity plan that really had input from over 50,000 California residents and stakeholders, and many within the disabled and aging community were participating in that. But we get that this is not the end of a process. This is really the beginning of the next phase, and it's critical that all stakeholders, that all impacted groups and residents continue to participate and have input in both the implementation of the digital equity plan and the design of the overall grant program and sub-grant program. So just really appreciate your comments and underscoring the importance of why we're all here.
Great. And another question, Scott, from Rebecca. You should be able to unmute now.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Rebecca Kaluma, Director of Digital Equity for the County of Los Angeles. Thank you very much for the update, Scott and team. I do have a couple of follow-up questions, and let me know if you guys are not able to answer it at this time. So I would like clarification if you guys are able to state what digital equity activities from the state plan do you guys anticipate will be subcontracted, meaning that you most likely partner with other state agencies within your partnerships to implement, and then what activities will be sub-granted out to eligible entities. And the reason why I ask that is here in Los Angeles County, we're working closely with various cities and other community partners to prepare for these grant funding opportunities. And many of our partners have expressed interest in working closely with the state to be able to support activities such as online accessibility, the digital equity mapping components, key stuff that was outlined as part of the notice of funding opportunity from NTIA. So we want to be able to understand what we can anticipate that they'll be able to apply for, or what you guys will perhaps most likely handle in-house or with a state agency to subcontract?
Got it. Thanks for the question, Rebecca. And if I may, what I would suggest is we hold off until Sean Doherty goes over the next phase, which is the kind of talk through the guidelines of the NTIA State Digital Equity Plan NOFO.
Okay.
And also share a little bit about the program design. The one thing that I would note is that there's a lot of the program that we would still like input on, and we want to make it clear that no decisions have been made on any procurements or subgrant distribution, that we fully intend to put a lot of these things out. And we'll talk about a survey we're going to be sending out in June. And then she'll also talk about the formal public comment process we'll be doing on the program itself. Okay.
All right, awesome. Thank you. And one other quick question, and let me know if it's best appropriate to be answered as part of the notice of funding opportunity portion of the agenda. Again, I know that the plan did highlight an emphasis on broadband subsidies, and ACP is obviously sunsetting officially at the end of this month. So I'm just curious to see if there will be some type of successor program as part of implementation of the plan, or will there be a strong focus on promoting low cost offers at this time?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rebecca. Part of that was going to be covered in Sean's topic, but I will say that during the planning process, the Affordable Connectivity Program was a major tool in the state's broader Broadband for All program to help address both affordability and increase adoption rates. We, along with the PUC, have advocated for the extension of or continuation of funding for that program. I think we're tracking it as others, and know it's a fluid situation. We did revise the plan to indicate that if the ACP goes away, we do have the infrastructure and partnerships in place to support promotion of existing low-cost offers, and would both seek any opportunity to promote any subsidies or successor programs that could help the ecosystem. I think Sean will talk a little bit about the NOFO and the allocation for subsidy programs, and then I'll happy to answer a question in the next section on that.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Scott, the majority of our questions in the Q&A are similarly about the notice of funding opportunity. So I'm gonna unmute Wally to ask their question, and then we might want to move on to the notice of funding so that we can start to answer some of the majority of the questions that are in the Q&A. So Wally?
That's Cole. And Scott, I wonder if you could speak for a moment to the general attitude of the state towards city and sub-regional digital equity plans that were funded by the PUC's LADA program.
Wally, can you go a little further on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
In other words, there is the state plan, and it has it. I don't want to say it's one size fits all, but it is a very specific sort of thing in a general way. We have a LADA grant that we developed a digital equity plan that is consistent with all the goals, but maybe takes a different configuration because we have very particular assets and in our subregion. So the question is what's your general attitude towards that? Is that something that you want to pursue? A lot of this would be like experimental, perhaps a demonstration project outside of the envelope that was defined by the state plan.
Got it. Thanks for the question, Wally, and for further clarifying that. I think once Sean's going to talk in a lot of detail. We are going to follow the federal guidelines in terms of how funds have to be allocated. They have to be directed towards eliminating barriers for covered populations. Both common and specific barriers that were identified. The funds have to support progress towards the measurable objectives and the goals of the plan. I think that given we have a broad idea of how we'd like to structure the program, that we would continue to like to understand your question. I think more broadly, we'd like to be able to have the capacity subgrant support, solutions that are implemented locally, whatever they may be, as long as they're consistent with, the target populations and the aims and the measurable objectives outlined in the plan.
Great. Thank you, Wally, for your question, and all those that are asking questions in the Q&A. I think, Scott, the best course of action is to go now into the notice of funding presentation and then return back to the majority of the questions that are in the Q&A. Back to you.
Great, thanks, Cole. My name is Sean Doherty. I am a director with the Broadband Equity Partnership, and I'm thrilled to be here and to partner and work alongside Scott and the CDT team on their digital equity efforts. Amanda, you can go to the next slide. So I want to spend just a few minutes kind of doing an overview of the capacity grant NOFO and just a moment or so on how we got here. As a reminder, back in November of 2021, with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Digital Equity Act was passed. And through the Digital Equity Act, it created 3 funding programs. A $60 million pot of funding for planning, for capacity, or for state digital equity planning, $1.44 billion in state digital equity capacity grants, and then another $1.25 billion in competitive grants. Earlier this year, with the acceptance and the approval of the California Digital Equity Plan, we kind of ended our planning grant. And as Scott mentioned, the day after, the capacity grant notice of funding opportunity was released. And that's kind of where we stand right now. We're in that process of developing the capacity grant response to the NOFO, to the notice of funding, which is due May 28th, which is Tuesday. And that is set in statute 60 days after the release of the NOFO. So we are working diligently towards that deadline. The NOFO also states that August 28th will be the day that it will be the last day for the first state award to be made. So not exactly the best wording, but by August 28th, we will begin to see states awarded their capacity grants. California, as Scott mentioned, is going in for their allocation of $70 million. And this is out of a total funding pool of $840 million. As I mentioned earlier, there's a total pool of $1.44 billion for the capacity grant program, but the NTIA has broken it up into 3 funding tranches. So the first funding tranche is at $800 billion, of which the state of California is receiving $70 million, and that's statutory formula of how we received it, and I'll discuss that actually on the next slide. But that funds will be expended over 5 years. So an anticipated end of period of performance right now is August 2029. Those dates are kind of subject to change based off of when the state of California actually receives its grant funding. But we're looking at a 5-year period of performance. And then there also should be, or we're anticipating or hopeful for 2 additional tranches of funding, one in 2025 and one in 2026. Both of those funding pools should be around $300 million. And if the formula remains the same, it would be about another $25 million in each of those tranches coming to the state of California. Those 2 tranches, the funding in those 2 tranches, however, are pending federal appropriations. So we have them grayed out as, they're not 100% guaranteed. But again, we remain incredibly hopeful that they will come to the states to be able to use to implement our state digital equity plans. Next slide, Amanda. Great. And as I mentioned, the 70 million, or if we're going to be specific, 70,226,453.82 is the allocation that was made to the state of California. That allocation is based off of this formula right here. 50% of it was based off of the population of the state when compared to all eligible state populations. 25% was based off of the member or the number of individuals within that state who identify as a member of a covered population, again, in comparison to all total members of covered populations through all eligible states. And then 25% was based off of the availability and adoption of broadband. Again, that a number was used from the ACS data, and again, based off of a total allocation when compared to all eligible states. So this is the formula that was used. It is in statute. It is in the NOFO, and so that is how the 70 million was allocated to the state of California. If you want to go to the next slide, Amanda. And the NOFO also clearly outlines how the states can use the funds that is allocated to them. Up to 20% of our 70.2 million may be used to update and maintain the plan or maintain our state digital equity plan. Up to 5% may be used on evaluation, specifically sub-grant evaluation. Up to 3% may be used on administrative costs. Up to 10% can be used on affordability subsidies. And the rest is remaining can be used on programmatic costs. And again, those percentages are caps, not floors. And this is the general breakdown of how the NOFO allows states to use their grant funding. Amanda, next slide, please. And this is an overview and kind of our basic structure of how the state is looking at its program, its overall capacity grant program structure. Obviously, the federal grant administrator is the NTIA, and they will distribute the $70.2 million down to the California Department of Technology. They are the state's administering entity and the grant recipient from the NTIA. And CDT will be responsible for overall grant administration, SDEP implementation, updates to the SDEP, and evaluation. And those are just kind of a general tasks managed and handled by that administering entity. The state then, as mentioned in the SDEP, intends to structure the plan as follows, looking at centralized services. Is there a way for the state to procure tools that can be used across the state to increase efficiencies and make it more effective to run digital equity programs? The state's also looking at what are some other state agency digital inclusion efforts? Is there a way that those existing efforts or maybe new efforts could be funded through the capacity grant? And then the state is also looking at a digital equity capacity sub-grant program to fund allowable, some of the allowable uses as mentioned in the NOFO and in the SDEP, such as digital literacy training, digital navigation, and other allowable uses such as that. Amanda, next slide, please. Great. And one really important piece that the NTIA is taking particular notice of is making sure that the states are implementing plans that are focused on meeting their measurable objectives and goals. And so performance and evaluation measurement is very important to the NTIA. And these are really some of the required, but really I think just some of the measurements that we will be looking at and that the NTIA will be looking at in developing sub-grant programs and through the implementation of the program. So we're going to be looking at, and NTIA is going to be looking at the number of covered populations served and how many people within each of those covered populations is served, how many individuals are being served in total, what type of programs are being implemented. Are these digital navigation programs, device distribution programs, digital literacy or workforce development programs? NTIA in the state is really interested in hearing personal testimony from those individuals who are engaging in programs and engaging with organizations and entities delivering those program services. And making sure that we're collecting quantifiable, really having data-driven decisions, and making sure that we're creating an impact on the state's policy outcome areas: education, healthcare, civic engagement and participation, in the 5 policy outcome areas that were identified in the NOFO and in the state digital equity plan. So all of these performance measures will be taken into consideration as we go through development. Amanda, next slide. And in one of the capacity grant frequently asked questions and FAQ sheet, it actually goes into the detail of what are some eligible entities for subgrants, right? We're looking at political agencies or instruments of the state, Native tribes, foundations, nonprofits, community anchor institutions. There's 8 listed here, and we can really look at those 8 or even partnerships between a lot of these entities. So as noted, or as stated in the FAQs for the capacity grant NOFO, these are just some of these are the eligible entities for the subgrants. And final slide for me, please, Amanda. Great. And again, these are really the focus of the programs and the focus of the permitting activities as described in the notice of funding opportunity. As mentioned, a focus on covered populations. Scott reviewed the 8 covered populations earlier, covered households, individuals with disabilities. Really focusing on those covered populations will be a focus of permitted activities and of programs. Are we creating long-lasting and meaningful change? Are the programs being funded, and are the programs serving, the covered populations being created in a sustainable way where these programs can outlast the funding, which is really for only 5 years? Really focus on sustainability. Measurable strategies. Are we creating strategies that are accountable, that are transparent, that are actually creating those data-driven measurements of success? And are we continuing to engage in stakeholder collaboration and continuing to work with individuals who identify as a member of a covered population, but also the entities and the organizations that serve members of those covered populations? And I'm going to end there, and Anne is actually, Wynn is going to talk a little bit more specifically about that stakeholder engagement.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
Before we, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I would just say before we move on to Anne's presentation, could we pause to address any specific questions or comments on the content that Sean just covered?
Yeah, exactly so. So this is a question and answer portion for the digital equity grant NOFO piece. So if you'd like to ask any question, again, there's the raise your hand feature or the Q&A feature, and the chat is enabled to have conversation as well. So I think a lot of the questions were answered, but maybe there's a reiteration, Sean or Scott, that can be done about when does the state expect to open applications so funds can get to local governments was one of the questions.
Yeah, and I think that Bruce Stewart asked that question. Bruce, we're going to show a timeline at the end of the presentation that kind of sketches out the key milestones here. So we'll share a visualization of that in a minute.
Great, thank you, Scott. And it looks like we do have a hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute the We Can Connect.
My question is about free apartment Wi-Fi. I know that they're doing it in Oakland and other places in California. Can anybody speak to whether there's a notice of funding opportunity, or what are the obstacles with other communities doing that?
I think it's a really good question, because obviously apartment Wi-Fi would fall under the broad goals of broadband for all, and the Public Utilities Commission has the public housing account, which they've expanded, and they're going to be implementing the BEAD program that could potentially allocate funds to those type of efforts. As it relates specifically to the digital equity capacity grant funds, based on the NOFO, typically the preference is for broadband deployment efforts to be funded by other programs. There may be some minor permissible expenses allocated through capacity grants, but we're trying to understand those more, so we can circle back with you if need be.
Thank you, Scott. There's a question related to how can local jurisdictions best prepare for the notice of funding or the subgrant programs? And specifically a question related to matching amounts. Is that going to be a requirement?
Okay, so local governments, I think it's a great question. We would like to hear from you on that. We're gonna go out with the program design surveys I mentioned at the top in June that really kind of further breaks out how we're looking at structuring the program, and are seeking input from folks. Part of that would be what kind of technical assistance would folks need to apply for capacity grant programs. But I think the question was, it is a good guide to use the digital equity plan, both the key activities, the measurable objectives, and the outcomes, is a guide to shape applications when those are due, which is going to be sometime still.
Great, thank you, Scott. And I did want to honor one question that was asked prior to the notice of funding kind of presentation piece, but maybe Sean or Scott, you can reiterate. The question was related to digital inclusion programs and what's going to be funded by the state digital equity capacity grant program. And their question just specifically is it their understanding is only programs managed by the state. So maybe a reiteration of those 3 buckets of programs that the capacity grant will provide funding for.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. I did see that question in the chat too, and I want to make sure that we're clear that there are many entities at the statewide level and at the regional and local level that are working on digital inclusion efforts. The capacity grant program will focus on entities that are effectively doing digital inclusion work at all of those levels, really to enable us to focus on the NOFO guidelines that we're really looking at. How do we maximize the impact of the capacity grant funding to make the biggest impact and outcomes for the most members of California's covered populations that could be impacted here. So we envision a combination of both digital inclusion programs offered by state entities and then a subgrant program that funds a broader set of digital inclusion activities by local and regional entities that could include any of the eligible entities that Sean had mentioned in her presentation.
Great, thank you, Scott. And I do see Rebecca has her hand raised, so Rebecca, you can now unmute.
Yes, thank you for that presentation. And again, out of formality here, Rebecca Kaluma, Director of Digital Equity for the County of Los Angeles. In terms of the 3 notice of funding opportunities, can you please clarify if that means that sub-grantees would then need to apply 3 times with the state?
Rebecca, I would love to have the answer to that question. We've been talking with the NTIA about that. What the only thing we can answer of certainty is the guidelines on the first tranche of funding. We won't know until the second and third rounds of funding how those would interact with the program structure and design that we established with the first tranche.
Okay, thank you. And then one other quick clarifying questions. And again, no worries if you're not able to answer at this time. In terms of process for grant funding, do you guys anticipate having a reimbursement process where you would reimburse based on services provided and delivered, or will a certain allocation of funding be provided to the grantees beforehand and then also provide reimbursement options?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, thank you for asking the question. I know you've been vocal about subgrant program design and things like that. We're looking at trying to be as flexible as possible, and actually that's going to be kind of some of the questions that we're going to ask a folks like you, for the survey that we put out, like what's the frequency of payment? Does it need to be reimbursed or paid up front? And then, taking the preference of the ecosystem and weighing against our own internal capacity and the guidelines of the grant itself.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. And just to provide clarification, the reason why I'm asking that is we do have a variety of small cities and also smaller nonprofit organizations that are excited to engage in as part of this process, but just given some of their typical experiences with restraint with federal and state grant funding, many of them have found it difficult to upfront the costs, especially if they're doing work around establishing like a public computer center or something like that. So any way to help alleviate the administrative burdens for our smaller cities as well as smaller organizations would be greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's a request to reiterate the eligible entities for the subgrants. Specifically, they're a nonprofit organization, and they're asking for a reiteration of those eligible entities.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Amanda, could you pull up the slides and just show that slide presentation? We will be sharing this. And again, this is these are the eligible entities that are listed in the state capacity grant, NOFO. Yeah. So right here, and Cole, was there a specific question here? There's foundation, corporation, institution, or association that is a not-for-profit entity. So I think there's a wide range of potential eligible entities.
Correct. And I think there's also a clarification on where potentially community-based organizations fit into this as well as an eligible entity.
Got it. Perhaps can we hear from the person asking the question? Like, I would like to understand if there's a distinction between a community-based organization that wouldn't fall within one of these descriptions.
We will have to ask if the anonymous participant who asked the question is willing to raise their hand and ask that question and maybe clarify a bit further.
Yeah, and perhaps they could just add further clarification in the chat, and we can try to clarify that.
In the meantime, depending on their answer, Amanda, you can lower the screen. There are two questions, Scott, that relate to how the notice of funding opportunity discusses affordable connectivity program or subsidy program kind of replacements. So is there anything that you can share related to ACP type funding through the notice of funding?
Well, I think we showed the pie chart. Up to 10% of the state digital equity capacity grant can go towards funding subsidies. And so 10% of 70 million would be 7 million. That's not a large amount of money when you consider that, currently there's 2.9, almost 3 million California residents that are signed up for the ACP. So I don't think it would make a significant dent in that. In terms of an ACP successor program, there's a lot of folks within the state and nationally that are still seeking ways to, urge Congress to extend authorization for each ACP funding, and folks looking at other options right now. We're just monitoring those situations and advocating where we can. But I think it's going to take some time to develop a solution if in fact ACP goes away.
Good. Thank you, Scott. And I think with that, the next set of questions actually relate to engagement and collaboration. So it would be a good time to bring Ann Wynn on and bring this PowerPoint back up and have Ann present.
Thank you, Cole. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Nguyen. I'm the Engagement and Operations Manager here at the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy with CDT. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to provide you with an update on ongoing engagement since the final plan was approved in March. And then more recently, next slide, please. More recently, our team has been conducting market research and listening sessions with various entities listed here, including state agencies, broadband consortia, local governments, CBOs, community-based organizations, as well as private sector entities. But that's not all, and more work has to be done, as alluded to by Scott and Sean. Next slide, please. Implementing this SDEP will require close collaboration across state government with local governments, community anchor institutions, and organizations that represent and serve each of the covered populations and other digitally disadvantaged communities. In collaboration with CPUC, CDT will continue to be the convening entity and leverage structures established as part of the planning process during the plan's implementation phase. As the state transitions into the implementation phase, targeted collaboration will continue, especially with groups representing covered populations. Comparable to the outreach and engagement process that inform the planning of the SDEP, implementation will include an inclusive and accessible multi-pronged approach. We invite you to engage in future programs designs through listening sessions and market research, as I have shared, but also program design survey later this summer, public comment period on the sub-grant program design, statewide digital equity implementation group, sound very similar to state planning group, outcome area working groups, community advisory committees, various webinars and public meetings. We also encourage you to stay updated on our Broadband for All portal. We included the link here for subscription to our monthly broadband email updates and the QR code as well. So at this time, I want to go to the next slide and invite Scott to share a few more details on our tentative timeline of capacity grant planning engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for walking that through. So I know folks had wanted to see a timeline of the next steps. And so, we'll start on the left with March 29th, which is when the NTIA released the capacity grant NOFO. The next key date is May 28th, when the application is due to the NTIA. And we're developing a broad application to them, understanding that we need to engage with you all to further shape the program design and develop a sub-grant program that's fair and equitable. And we can't get ahead and develop that program until the award is made. As Sean mentioned, no later than August 28th, there's anticipated that the first state will receive a capacity grant award. I want to direct your attention to the gray box at the bottom that really there's some concurrent activities that are going to go on over the next several months, and that's continued stakeholder engagement through the design survey that Anne referenced, and additional market research to help inform any procurements or other centralized services that would be leveraged to support the ecosystem and sub-grantees. We do expect to have a formal proposal to the stakeholder community and do a formal public comment process sometime in the early fall, and then finalizing the sub-grant program and putting a request for applications between October and November. Do also want to state that really 30 days after the first state is awarded their capacity grants, the NTIA by statute or statute must release their competitive grant program, which is going to be a program that entities within the state can apply directly to the NTIA for. And, we'll definitely do our best to make sure that folks are aware of that when it's posted, and support folks in any way we can to apply for those grants. Going back to to above, there was a question that came in the pre-registration questions about Native entities or California American tribes. California tribes will be eligible for state funding, but also NTIA has set aside a portion of the National Digital Equity Capacity Grants to create a separate $46 million pool for Native entities to apply for both sort of combo planning and capacity grants. In the NOFO, it stated that would open on September 25th and close on February 7th of next year. So that's going to be another source of funding. And then, sorry, with the flow of the timeline, what we do want to point out is that, while we expect a state award between, sometime between now and on or about August 28th or shortly thereafter, that states will have 9 months from the time of their award to identify all projects and grantees that will be funded out of this tranche. And so when you look at the right side of the timeline, that's that May 25th, we have time collectively to further work with you all to design the overall program, design the sub-grant program, and then to institute fair and competitive processes, be they procurements or grants, that award these funds out to eligible entities to support implementation of the plan.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Anne, for that presentation. We'll now move into the question and answer portion for the engagement and collaboration. So again, if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand feature and we will unmute you. And please, if you want to use the Q&A feature, that is the best place to get a question asked. And the chat is enabled. There is a question about how an entity can partner with the Office of Broadband Digital Literacy and Department of Technology to present on the plan, specifically in their case to adult education communities. So can we share how entities can request opportunities for presentations on this material specifically to their communities?
Yes, I think on the we can drop our contact information into the chat. I would like to understand the question. Are you saying folks would like us to come and give this presentation to their communities?
This specific person's interested because they convene with adult education communities throughout the year and would like their educational providers to have details on what they can do with the state digital equity plan, the access to the funds and the grants, and then regular updates on the rollout. So many of their learners are of the groups listening and listed in the plan.
Got it. Yeah. So absolutely cool. Our contact information will be on the slides, and one of our staff members will drop it in the chat. We're happy to come and do briefings. We would also just want to reiterate that a recording of this meeting, the slide presentation itself, and the transcripts will be posted on the Broadband for All portal once they're remediated, and those are can be used as well to further promote out to the community.
Great, thank you, Scott. And now, Hector, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear? Oh, thank you. Hector Ramirez, Los Angeles County. I forgot to mention, I'm a member of the Los Angeles County Commission on Disabilities, and the California Commission on Disabilities. So the comments that I make are my own and just based on the experience. And here in Los Angeles County, I personally have seen the deployment of one of your grants to our communities, and have personally really have seen face to face the excitement in individuals being able to benefit from this benefit, getting support, and definitely the hardware. It was really excited. There was a period that was open for a short period of time where people could go pick up devices and get training. And I went with some of our elders that were able to qualify, and I saw firsthand the benefit, and I see it to this day as I get calls of folks that are on their devices or being able to connect. And it really highlighted to me the significant importance of this benefit. But I also wanted to recommend that as you continue your outreach strategies, a target area for outreach is our domestic violence shelters. This particular benefit and the various ways that it can be applied can really not only function as a general purpose service, but as a emergency response type of benefits for individuals that get displaced, not necessarily from trauma and abuse, but as we have more and more climate-related natural disasters and we have emergency situations, there's a lot of folks that not only get displaced, but lose this particular ability to connect. And we know that now one of the best ways to really help connect people to services and to alleviate is really having them have this particular access. So really perhaps looking for a strategy to continue to further fund this so that we don't lose the funding or it gets interrupted, because people do benefit, but I definitely see so much potential like the two populations that I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Cole, I want to say, I know folks are busy. We did allocate an hour and a half for this briefing, knowing that there was a lot of interest in folks, a lot of folks who registered. I want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to ask questions and for us to do our best to respond to all those questions while we're here together.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. There's questions that are going by in the chat. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A, that will allow us to kind of further make sure we don't miss those questions. But there is, I've seen it a couple times, Scott, a question on how the state budget affects the state digital equity capacity grant programs.
Yeah, got it. I know a lot of people are tracking the state budget on the subject matter that we're discussing today, which is the federal state capacity grant that the state is applying for and will receive to implement the digital equity plan. Since we have not yet applied for the grant and the award has not been received and it's got pretty strict requirements, I don't think it's currently impacted by the broader state budget considerations.
Great, thank you, Scott. This is a pretty technical question. So will the capacity grant opportunities go through the CMAS process for applications? So we might also have to explain for those that don't know what CMAS is, how to answer that question.
Yes, CMAS is a qualified vendor program through the state. I think how funds are distributed will depend on for what purpose. So under the auspices of centralized services, that those might be procured, and those might go through CMAS or another competitive procurement vehicle run by the state. The state is frequently doing the request for innovative ideas or RFI squared process. In the discussions on funding state agencies, digital inclusion efforts, we're identifying, which opportunities are out there that would fall within the budget and have the biggest scale, and determining what the best vehicle would be, whether state agencies would, just enter into interagency agreements with the Department of Technology and funds would be transferred on the sub-grant program itself, we don't envision that going through CMAS. We would set up a different vehicle that would enable a larger pool of applicants to apply for those.
Great, thank you, Scott. I'm gonna ask one question. Oh, actually, let's go to Mateen, who has a hand raised first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maiten. I'm the program coordinator at the City of San Diego for the Digital Equity Initiative, SD Access for All. And I had just a quick question. You know, in the case of the City of San Diego, we will not be eligible for BEAD funding, and likely just based on the FFA proposals that we've seen, would probably not benefit from FFA infrastructure money either. And so I'm just wondering if you're taking that into consideration as far as like distributing the funds for the digital equity or the capacity grants. I guess the fact that urban areas might not benefit so much from the infrastructure money versus kind of more rural areas.
Got it, Maiten. Good to see you, and thank you for the question. I hope the new job is working out well.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So I think here would be the question. We're going to follow the federal guidelines on eligible entities for the subgrants, and we want to hear from folks during the when we send out the program design survey and also in the public comment process. We, you know, Amanda, if you could, well, you don't have to, you can bring up the slide again. There were 8 boxes. The last 2 were coalitions of entities applying for funds. And given the need in the state and the amount of funding we have, I do think that there is the intent of the NTIA is to encourage you know, coalitions of entities to go in together and submit applications. And there's potentially a role for, you know, political subdivisions like cities or counties to, you know, go in as a main applicant or a partner applicant.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And I do want to also acknowledge, I think Right to Learn asked a similar question and would offer the floor to them to come off of mute in case there's a further information they need related to their question about recommendations for partnerships. Additionally, there's a question that's being asked, Scott, to quantify potentially the pie chart that's been shared to better understand, from it looks like in the chat from Patrick about communities being able to better plan so they understand the grant pockets or the grant availability on a local basis.
Yeah, so I would thank you for asking the question. And was that a Patrick question or was it applied to multiple questions?
It was in the chat and it went by briefly for me, so I believe it's a Patrick question.
Sure. Amanda, could you pull up the pie chart real quick? Okay. Well, I think to answer the question here, and appreciate that people are wanting to know, what we wanted to present to you is what the NOFO said and the guidelines or the goalposts that they set for the state. And so per the NOFO, states can allocate up to 20% of the allocation to update and maintain the SDEP. You know, we can allocate up to 5% for evaluation, up to 3% for administration, and up to 10% for subsidies. It is our intent to do this, develop this program with your input as fast as we can, knowing that that folks are really looking forward to these funds to help implement the plan. and to do it as efficiently as possible, and to put as much into programmatic or the sub-grant program as we possibly can. Thanks, Amanda. You can take that down.
Great, thank you, Scott. The someone's saying right to learn. If you can unmute, you can further clarify your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. So hi, Zandy Wright, Right to Learn. You answered this in part, I think. So I understand that small, especially smaller nonprofits would certainly be eligible for funding through the NOFO from the state. Curious about whether the sort of preferred or recommended strategy would be, if you are a smaller nonprofit or if you are coming into this digital equity work more recently rather than having a lot of prior experience in this space, if you would recommend working with a coalition to submit a joint project, or if there's likely to be sort of additional supports for those smaller organizations that may not have a grant writer on staff already able to dig deeply into this. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I think it's a great question. I think it would just depend. There's so much dimensionality as we've learned, and folks have informed us about the dimensionality of, yes, there are common digital equity barriers, but for each of the covered populations, there are very specific barriers that they face, and there are many different trusted partners and entities that can have an impact. I think, part of the process that we're trying to work out is how do we right-size this program to make sure that there's an equitable distribution of funds that have the biggest impact for the most amount of people. And I think we're really counting on further input and collaboration with the ecosystem to help us figure out what the right distribution and the right sizing of this should be. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on and further clarifying your question. I think as a follow-up, Scott, there is a question that is asking, will the state accept applications from a CBO or a city that does not want to participate in a regional application?
Potentially, it would just, depend on the how the program's designed and the quality of the application.
Great, thank you, Scott. Kevin, you can now unmute.
Hi, Kevin Miller, Fresno Coalition for Digital Inclusion. I just wanted to follow up on the question that Patrick had asked in the chat, which was answered in part, and I think you had a different slide on this, which was more about the distribution of the 70 million between subgrants versus programmatic activities taken on by CDT or other state entities.
Yeah.
I.e., what percentage of that is looking to be subgrants to CBOs and local entities?
Yeah, I think, Kevin, the best way that I can answer it is that there are statutory up to limits that are required in the that are included in the federal guidance or the notice of funding opportunity from the NTIA. It is our commitment to be as efficient in the use of the funds, meaning that if we can utilize funding to do those activities in smaller percentages than what is allowed, it is our intention to put as much of it into program and granting as we can.
I'm pausing to make sure that we have a follow-up from Kevin. And with that, I will ask Rebecca to unmute. Rebecca, you should be able to unmute.
All right, sorry about that. I was hitting the button as you guys were unmuting me. That's why I was a little bit delayed. Again, Rebecca Coloma, Director of Digital Equity, County of Los Angeles. Just a quick follow-up question, just to make sure we're understanding things correctly. From from a Los Angeles County region standpoint, just so that way the state is aware as well. The national recommendation that we're hearing, at least for the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program, is strongly focused on establishing partnerships, coalitions as part of that grant funding, especially considering the fact that with that funding, we're not competing with just people within our respective state, but also across the country. So that has been the informal recommendation that we have received from various different spaces. So I know you guys are not saying whether or not that would be favorable in an application, but is it fair to say that that would hold? I know you said that like if somebody has a strong application, even coming in by themselves, like that would be fine, but would it be fair to also say that those types of partnerships where we're able to have like cross-sector impact would be favorable in this space?
I think so, Rebecca.
Okay.
I mean, like one way that I would respond to this is that there are very few singular activities or covered populations or goals or measurable objectives that apply to only one entity. And what we heard throughout the digital equity planning process, and including the digital equity plan, was to encourage collaboration and alignment at all levels to increase efficiency. I think that it's a smart approach, whether it's for state subgrants or competitive grants, to folks to be working with partners and coalitions to craft solutions that can make the best use of funds to have the biggest impact in their particular focus area.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful because that's our strategy here within LA County. But again, that has been the primary recommendation that we've received for more so the national and federal grant programs. So we want to make sure that we're setting up our region for success and also applying that strategy perhaps as part of the state digital equity capacity grant program, because many of our organizations have also expressed that perhaps they may not feel comfortable being a primary grantee, but would be open being like a sub-grantee and receiving funds from whoever that fiscal agent and primary grantee would be. So that's the only question that I have. I just wanted to do a quick response to the other colleague who had the question about coalitions. I don't know what community you're from in California, but I did want to point out that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance is a resource. So if you are looking for a coalition that perhaps is spread out throughout the state, definitely feel free to reach out to them because they're supporting communities across the country to ensure that they can get plugged into a coalition. And I'll make sure to drop the link in the chat for that colleague who had that question. Thank you again for your guys' time. And I'm done asking questions for today. And I'll circle back in email if I have any more questions. But thank you guys for answering my questions today.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Eileen, you can unmute.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for hosting this. This is really informational, and I know we're building a lot of it collectively, so excited to hear there's some public comment period coming up. The question I had was about measurements, and I know on the slide it talked about that some of the federal requirements will be looking at, number of people served and the number of covered populations served. Do you imagine some of the sub-grant reporting requirements would match those metrics? That's the types of things we'd be expected to measure through these programs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I would perceive that that's the core around which the state would build the sub-grant program and actually, allocate funds, whether it's the centralized services state agency or sub-grantees, that would be the evaluation criteria, and the metrics are a good base to build around. And I would say Eileen, one of the things that we want to hear from the ecosystem is what might some other criteria or measurements be to consider for the state sub-grant program.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Patrick, you can unmute.
I appreciate it. And Scott, thanks for hosting this webinar and for all the updates on timelines. Those projected dates are super helpful. As you know, this is not a cheap problem to solve, but we're really lucky in California to have so many local orgs doing the work. And one of the questions that I'm getting as helping to lead the coalition here in Oakland is, what's a realistic amount for us to be asking for? We have an annual operating budget of $1 million to do exclusively digital equity activities. Could we ask for 2.5 million? So I think one of the reasons I'm trying to get some clarity on the 70 million is I want to be able to go to a local org and say, listen, the state of California is getting 70 million, but of that, we only anticipate up to blank percentage or up to 35 million being distributed across the entire state of California. So a grant ask, south of $1 million is going to give you a much more accurate chance of getting funded. And I know you can't get into specific amounts, but I'm just trying to understand the pie chart of the sub-grantee. Is that the section that's SDEP, or is that the program chunk of the pie? Would really appreciate any insights just so I can level set and make sure that the orgs in my community are coming up with realistic proposals and really great proposals with enough time. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So I want to reiterate that the pie chart itself is just a visualization of what the Notice of Funding Opportunity stipulates that administering entities can spend up to for those various functions. And so, your math, we specifically didn't percentage on the programmatic side because, like I said, it's our intention to try to be as efficient as possible, to not go up to those percentage ceilings for maintenance and update of the digital equity plan or administration or evaluation, and that to put the most of it into to actually program that drives impact for covered populations. I think what I would refer people to is the chart that we had on how the NTIA determined the state's allocation, which was the three different buckets. First, 50% was the state's population in proportion to the total population of all other states. The second was 25% of the formula went to the number of members of covered population in the state in proportion to the population of covered, or the members of covered population in other states, and then 25% based on the relative availability of broadband and adoption figures that used a number of things. Yeah, so right here, that was the formula that factored in what allocation was determined for the state of California. So I think this could be a good foundation for a conversation with the ecosystem about how these funds could be distributed within the state, given the direction that the NTIA is given for focusing on covered populations and outcomes that were outlined in the digital equity plan. Does that help, Patrick?
Patrick, you can unmute.
Yeah, so definitely appreciate that, California did all it could to get as much of those federal dollars as possible. And I know that was a lot of work from CDT, so just deeply appreciative of that. I think what I'm just trying to make a little sense of is, was that pie chart for the distribution of the 70 million, is that kind of like going to be worked out in the process? Or at this point, do we know that there's a cap? You know, CDT, if we give out every dollar that we can to sub-grantees, to community-based orgs, the most it can possibly be based on federal rules that we have nothing to do with is this many million. I don't want people to go into this grant process with unrealistic expectations, and I want them to be really intentional about how they design their grants. And I just think if we're talking about 20 million, it's a lot different than 70 million. And I just want to have a sense of that. If you're not able to provide that now, I want to stay really engaged in this process. I know we're early on, but just the sooner I can say, like, you're a pretty small org, you know, your impact is powerful, but it's very, you know, it's a very small part of California. Keep it under 500K, or, you know, dream big. It's 70 million. So whatever you can offer there, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Patrick. I definitely would set the expectations when we look at the size of the need in the state of California. 70 million's amount that the state of California will be grateful to receive, and it's not, as we said in the digital equity plan, going to be enough to accomplish the goal. We're going to need to seek other funding to strategically, you know, folks within the ecosystem go after competitive grant dollars, to partner with private sector and philanthropy to, you know, help generate those outcomes and continue to look at different funds. I think, Amanda, thank you for bringing up this pie chart. That the way that I would look at this, Patrick, is that no more than 20% can be spent on maintaining and updating the digital equity plan. No more than 5% on evaluation, no more than 3% on administration, no more than 10% on subsidies. So if you add that together, that's like 38%. And so, you know, what our job would be to do is to be as efficient as possible, and not to spend as wisely as we can on those categories, so that the most amount of money can go to sub-grants.
There is I think 2 or 3 more questions. I know we've allocated an hour and a half, but I do want to kind of address a couple more questions because they should be pretty easy ones for us to respond to. Is will infrastructure grants be part of this program?
I'm sorry, Cole, can you repeat the question? My audio broke up.
Sorry, will infrastructure grants be a part of this opportunity?
They will not.
Yep, thank you.
There may be a few minor exceptions, but not of the kind that the NOFO is very clear that broadband deployment and infrastructure projects should, you know, be addressed by other programs like the BEAD program.
Great, thank you, Scott. And then as part of the market research, the listening sessions, I mean, I think the broader engagement and collaboration, that's my words adding. Are there plans to engage stakeholder organizations in a defined geography or serving specific covered populations and a collective community-wide effort, or to be an individual organizational basis? And it might be worth reiterating about outcome area working groups and statewide implementation groups.
Yeah, sure. Do you mind if, can you or Sean take that answer?
Sean, why don't you go ahead?
Well, do you mind repeating it? Sorry.
Yeah, we can do it together, and I'll repeat the question. It's a question on are there plans to engage stakeholder organizations in defined geographies or serving specific covered populations? And I see Anne also came off of mute too. So Anne, I think let's do this. Let's defer to you and to share about outcome area working groups one more time.
Of course. I think the question came from Andrew. So Thank you for asking the question in the Q&A, Andrew. The outcome area working group, if you remember originally this past planning process, we had it divided up into 6 subjects, right? 6 focus area: education, health, workforce development. I think what we're looking at in the future engagement effort is putting it back to the public, to you all, to help us define what works for, if we were to say have 6 outcome area again, do those subjects outcome areas the focus of this upcoming implementation process, or could it be better shaped to another thematic, if you will, that would produce more conversation and discussion? So I think we're very open to that, and if that's kind of how you would see us organize outcome area working group, I think that's a conversation that we can continue having. And then your question specifically about whether it would be regionally, I think that could be a possibility, but open to hear more about your ideas of what that could look like too.
Great, thank you, Anne. And then just wanted to share, there were 2 questions, and I think they should be acknowledged more as recommendations than questions, but worth sharing out. There's a question about having a separate webinar specific for tribal entities when their application window opens in September. And then also a question related to how the application process for the capacity grant program could be benefited by having a streamlined process for those with disabilities. So just wanted to share those 2 questions as good suggestions.
Yeah, and cool, thank you for that. And we do want to note that as part of the planning process, we did have a specific tribal collaboration working group where that convened, California Native tribes and tribal serving entities to help inform the plan. And we fully intend to reinstate that during implementation, and to the extent that the state support is needed or requested, we fully intend to support California Native tribes to both take advantage of digital equity, state digital equity capacity grant funding, and the specific NTIA funding that's coming up in September.
Thank you, Scott. I want to share that I think we've addressed the majority of the questions that are asked in the Q&A, and would request that there is one question that's asking for a written response, to please send it to the digitalequity@state.broadband.ca.gov, and it's in the chat. Excuse me, I misspoke on the actual title. So Scott, why don't you wrap us up?
Yeah, just want to say thank you to everyone who took time out of their day to participate in this briefing and discussion. We're very grateful for your subject matter expertise, for your partnership, and for your efforts in both, shaping the digital equity plan and now working towards implementation. And we just want to acknowledge that there is more program design work to be done, and that we are committed to both designing the program and dispersing the funds in a very fair and open and competitive and accountable process to drive the best outcomes for the state of California. So just thank you very much, and have a wonderful 3-day weekend.